Good morning, everyone. I'm Ryan Enos. I'm a professor of government. I'm the director of the Center for American Political Studies at Harvard. Welcome to the Political Analytics Conference. I'm here to just very briefly answer the question of what are we doing here and why are we here. A lot of you just get really excited about politics, and that's why you're here. But we're also here because politics is important, and we understand that. Who wins elections, it affects every aspect of our lives, from richness to poverty to life and death in some cases. And so we want to make sure that we rigorously understand politics. We know that it's important to rigorously understand it. And I think this is true now more than ever. I've been studying politics for over 20 years now, actually, as a scholar. And some of you have been doing this for longer. And I think for many of us, we didn't in some ways actually even appreciate just how important politics was until recently. And so politics deserves every bit of sophistication we can bring to it. We shouldn't leave it to vibes or something like that any more than we would leave something like medicine to vibes. It really deserves our rigorous analysis. But just because it's important doesn't mean it's easy. Politics is something that's really, really hard. Studying politics is hard, and it's probably harder now than it ever has been because politics is really changing. So things we once took for granted are no longer true. They're no longer things there are things that we once knew we can no longer just assume. And so hopefully for people in this room, including myself, what that means is we double down on our analytical approach to politics. We try to bring a sharper lens to it than we've ever had. So this is why we revived this conference. We took a 7-year hiatus on this, and now we're back because we thought it was more important than now to bring smart people together to discuss politics and try to learn these answers to who wins elections and why. So as our tagline says, what we're doing is we're bringing critical analysis to uncertain times, and we're hoping to learn a lot from each other here today. So my co-organizers in this conference are Liberty Vittert Capito and Scott Tranter. We, in addition to the Center for American Political Studies that I direct, we're also sponsored by Decision Desk HQ and HarrisX, and also here at Harvard, the Harvard Data Science Initiative and the Harvard Data Science Review and the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. So while you're here, I hope to get a chance to interact with all our sponsors and find out all the things they have to bring here to the analysis of politics. And with that being said, to introduce our first panel, I'm going to turn it over to my current senior thesis student, Alex Heiss.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us bright and early on this lovely Friday. My name is Alex Heiss. I am a senior at the college studying government on the data science track. I'm originally from Minnesota, and it is my pleasure to introduce our lovely election analyst panel this morning. Dave Wasserman is senior editor and elections analyst at the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and a contributor at NBC, specializing in U.S. House races and the impact of redistricting. He was selected as 2024 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a program dedicated to researching polarization in the United States. He's also a violinist and a traditional music fan. Jacob Rubashkin is deputy editor at Inside Politics, providing nonpartisan analysis for presidential, congressional, and gubernatorial races across the country. He was previously a contributor at 538 and worked at the Edison Research Decision Desk in 2020. Back in his college years, he was editor-in-chief for Cornell's version of the Crimson, the Cornell Daily Sun. Geoffrey Skelley is chief elections analyst at Decision Desk HQ and former senior elections analyst at 538. He writes Decision Desk HQ's Substack newsletter, The Bellwether, covering all things elections, from polls to prediction markets. He formerly worked as associate editor at Sabato's Crystal Ball. Our discussion this morning will be moderated by Andrew Reeves, professor and director at Weidenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy at Washington University in St. Louis. His research focuses on political institutions, democratic governance, accountability, and the intersection of geography and politics. I don't know about you all, but I have seen enough to know that this is going to be a great panel, and I'll turn it over to them now. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the organizers of this really wonderful day and yesterday of events. So we heard some brief bios, but I'm wondering if you all could each tell us a little more about what exactly the organization you work for does, and what do you actually do there on a day-to-day level? Dave, you want to start?
Well, it's great to be with fellow nerds here and analysts who I really admire and respect. I look forward to seeing more today. I have, it's hard to believe I've been in the Cook Political Report for 18 years now, and a lot has changed in this field over that time. My approach has always been to try and blend the qualitative and the quantitative, and I think in the past 15 years we've seen an explosion of interest overall in politics. I remember feeling lonely as a C-SPAN nerd in the late 1990s, and now it feels like thousands of kids who have developed an algorithm in high school to predict the next presidential election. But my advice has always been to start out with congressional elections and study what happens in those, because oftentimes they can, what I love about House races, and I think you guys probably share this, is that they can give us insights into what voters are looking for in larger races a couple of years ahead of time. And I remember in the early 2010s when we were seeing a lot of Republican open seats where there were crowded fields of legislators and mayors, and yet there'd be a self-funding business person who came in and railed against Washington, and they were mopping the floor with a lot of people who had climbed the ladder the traditional way. And in retrospect, that should have been a clue as to what was going to happen in 2016. In 2018, we saw a lot of Democrats come through our offices who had national security backgrounds. Many of them were women. That was the kind of profile that broke through in 2018. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the kind of profile that leads to the next Democratic president or national office holder. So I've always sought to study what's coming down the pike in terms of demographic trends and immerse myself in spreadsheets, because if you're not doing that, you're missing half the picture. But I've also tried to interview as many candidates as possible, because if you're not talking to the media consultants and pollsters who are actually involved in strategy and race, you're missing half the picture as well. And I think I'll just, before I pass it to you guys, one of my favorite moments in this job was in 2010. Nate Silver, who I hadn't met yet, emailed me and asked if he could come kind of see what we did at the Cook Political Report on a day-to-day basis. And I said, great, if you come on Thursday, I have like 3 candidates coming through, and you can be our intern for the day. And so I introduced him to all the candidates as my intern, Nate. And like a few of them kind of figured out who he was, but there was a candidate from northern Wisconsin on the Republican side who owned a minor league baseball team, and he came in with 2 consultants. And towards the end, Nate was peppering him with questions about his minor league prospects, and they still never figured out that it was Nate Silver. So I thought that was kind of funny.
But did Nate Silver get anybody coffee?
I'm not sure I assigned him that task, but.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is on or not, but I'll keep talking. What do we do at Inside Elections? We do everything the Cook Political Report does, but a little bit worse.
A little bit better.
No, I think that the approach that we try to take at Inside Elections is to be as comprehensive as possible when looking at House races, Senate races, especially presidential as well. My approach has always been, I do try to be holistic. I think it's important not only to talk about who's going to win, even though who's going to win is important, but what kind of people they are, where they come from, what they're about, right? So we do our race ratings, we do our projections, and that's a huge part of what we do and what we're known for. But I also spend a ton of time getting to know the districts, getting to know the candidates, sitting down with them, their teams, their families, and understanding what kind of member of Congress are they going to be? What brought them in their life to this moment where now they could potentially be making decisions for hundreds of millions of Americans around the country. And so we write long stories where we try and get at the thrust of not only what's going on in the election, but who the characters are, who the players are, and what they'll look like once they get to Congress. And I think that's incredibly important because that's not necessarily the kind of thing that can be boiled down to a spreadsheet. Like Dave, I have 1,000 spreadsheets open on my computer at any given time, but we still, I think, do believe that there's something a little bit intangible as well that's important. And, beyond that, I try and break a little news every now and then. I think that's still an important part of this game is that there's a lot that we don't know and that we're trying to project, but there's a lot that we don't know that we can go out and find, right? When we think about who's running for office, what kind of candidate might be running for office, those are answerable questions. You can go out and with a little bit of elbow grease and legwork, figure out who's putting together a congressional campaign, who's gearing up for a Senate run, and get ahead of the curve there. And I think that's an incredibly important part of the job as well, is understanding, what really is coming down the line, not just what the probability is, but, this candidate is going to get in the race and that's going to affect it in this particular way. And nobody else knew that until we went out and found it.
Yeah, very well. I'm not sure if this is working either, but is it just not on? Now, yeah, there we go. So Decision Desk HQ is an operation that provides election data for a lot of media organizations and other organizations. Election night, gathering what's coming in, and then also having just reams and reams of data about, voter registration, past electoral results. I came on to Decision Desk HQ to try to help sort of put that in one place and put it out there more. Analytically, I would say that I basically agree with everything that's just been said here. In terms of sort of the holistic approach, I came up through the third of the sort of three ratings groups. You got Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, and then I was at Sabato's Crystal Ball for many years. And so I come from sort of the same school where I have a lot of spreadsheets, and I spend a lot of time looking at historical data particularly, and trying to understand what's happening in elections. But at the same time, I think you have to have at least some degree of qualitative observation of things, because sometimes things happen that you don't expect and or don't necessarily match what you kind of anticipated from the numbers. And I would say, actually, for me, just to the thing that I think I particularly like to do is just kind of broadly in terms of my approach to thinking about politics is I'm a complete history nerd. So I'm very interested in what's happened before, because I think it's not that history repeats itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And so if you're trying to sort of think about, well, this hasn't happened before. Well, usually it has. It's just you have to go a little bit further back than 1960, which seems to be sort of like a cutoff point for a lot of people in sort of American political history. The late 19th century right now is the easiest comp to sort of where we are right now in terms of just highly polarized, very divided country. And seeing some of the stuff that's going on with mid-decade redistricting. Hey, there was a lot of that in the 1880s and 1890s, and for the exact same reason. Parties were trying to gain whatever possible small edge they could get in a very closely divided polity where it felt like every little seat could matter to your chances of having control. So for me, that's an important aspect of what I do, is I try to take a kind of a longer view of where our politics is now and how that fits into the larger story, and also finding just past examples that are helpful.
What's really striking to me is that a lot of us in this room might, be pollsters. We run a poll, we have an answer. We're quantitative social scientists. We run a model, we get an answer. You guys stand between the data science, the journalism, the historical context. So at the expense of potentially re-asking the same question, I'm wondering, what do you see as the special sauce? Like, do you have you talked about historical context. Is when you're trying to make a tough call on a particular race, is there something that maybe it's just your internal favorite that you really rely on to make those judgment calls because you're not having the model that produces, the right answer?
Yeah, we have a ton of data points to draw from when we're analyzing a race. And I think the secret sauce is knowing how to calibrate them and determining, okay, which one of these factors is important in this specific election because it varies so much. And there are always going to be factors that are unquantifiable that impact races. But for example, sometimes it's a rapid demographic shift of an area. I remember I felt like we were able to see that there was a possibility that Mary Bono Mack might lose to Raul Ruiz in 2012 because we were looking at the census data in Riverside County, California. I'm really dating myself. But then in 2022, Democrats were able to outspend Republicans by quite a bit in some of the most competitive House races, which allowed them to overperform in those districts. Same thing in 24, particularly after Republicans ousted their most effective fundraiser as Speaker. And then there are there are districts where a candidate's unique baggage, whether it's an incumbent or a challenger, is the defining characteristic. So I'd say the secret sauce is really being able to know which of those buckets of variables is the most impactful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think calibration is an incredibly important element to this because every cycle, I think the factors matter a little bit differently. Some cycles are more about national environment. Some cycles, it's much more diffuse. It's much more about, what's going on in any one particular state or even in one particular section of one particular state. I feel like 2022 was a good example of a year where there really was, if you were looking at the national environment in 2022, you were going to be led astray and you had to understand that the circumstances going on the ground in Michigan, for instance, were very different than the circumstances in New York or in California, and that Oregon was different than all three of those states and things like that. So understanding and being able to keep your ear to the ground can be incredibly important. I would say, though, in terms of, I'm a little hesitant to label any one particular thing a secret sauce because I don't want to make what we do, and I won't speak for these guys, but I don't want to make it too much of a black box because it is heavily informed by a tremendous amount of data, a tremendous amount of indisputable fact that we're looking at. But I will say that in the few instances where we're making judgment calls, because every cycle there are a couple of races where you realize you're kind of on the bubble. You can go this way or you can go that way. Do we keep this race in toss-up? Do we move it to tilt Democratic? Is this on our map or is it off the map? And what I do is I look at my boss and I ask him what he thinks because he's been doing this for the better part of 25 years. And so over the sweep of that quarter century, don't tell him I said that, he's watched thousands of these races go by. And to Jeff's point, there are a lot of similarities in our politics, right? It's not that the same thing is always happening, but things resemble each other. And if you know how things used to turn out or have turned out in the past, you can develop an intuition that has proven so far, knock on wood, very accurate. And so I think just kind of understanding what has happened before, understanding the broad sweep of House race history, Senate race history, and relying on that intuition to serve you well is, in those rare judgment cases, an important factor.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything brilliant to add because they've said so much there. I mean, I think if thinking about like secret sauce, I guess it's in some ways I'm not sure I have one. It's an appreciation for the many different aspects of a particular race that you're looking at. Whether, I don't know, you're looking at like a polling average. Okay, the polls are really close in this race. Well, that's, I think actually if there's anything that all of my time looking at American politics has shown me, it's like maybe the secret sauce is embracing uncertainty. Maybe that's actually the best way to think about it. And that's, so I guess if I have a secret sauce, it's that. And that's because, if you're staring at a polling average, okay, someone's up by a point or two. I mean, what is that telling you? That's telling you it's a close race and that, okay, maybe one candidate has a slight edge, but not one that you would, go to the bank with. And if you're looking for other ways of differentiating things, it's like you're looking at the national environment, you're looking at what other things are happening in that particular state or district. And so I guess for me, it's like, if anything, I just am always sort of prepared for, you're seeing election results come in on election night and you're like, oh, where's this going to go? Oh, okay, this might be going differently than we expected, or at least it's of the universe of outcomes is maybe on the periphery of what the possibilities seem to be. And it's just always being open to that possibility. I think when I think about like the 2022 example for Democrats not actually losing that much ground in the House. And I think going into that election, it was interesting. There was a lot of talk about like polling averages and how well were Republicans going to do. And going into it, it was like, well, historically, we expect the president's party to lose ground in the House. That usually happens. Not always, but usually. But at the same time, there was this added factor that we knew was complicating things, which was that even though the Democrats were in control of everything, Republicans had gotten this big policy win because the Supreme Court had overturned Roe v. Wade. And that was creating complications with, I think, the sort of picture of Democrats are going to get totally, they're going to experience the usual presidential penalty in a midterm. And so they ended up getting, a much softer one. And I think it's sort of recognizing that the interplay of these different things can come together. And so if I'm thinking about like the 2026 midterms, obviously there's going to be complications because of things like redistricting in terms of thinking about the math. There's the president's approval rating, there's just a lot of different factors. And I guess, the easiest thing to say right now is that like, oh, well, Democrats are probably favored to take back the House. But I think especially after all the experiences of, watching election results, looking back over historical data and whatnot, it's like you have to be open to the possibility that maybe something will happen that's, it's a 98 or a 2002 and it's, flips on you a little bit. So that uncertainty, I think, is important.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to invite questions from the audience. You brought up redistricting a couple of times. I'd be remiss if I did not ask
this man's Twitter account is redistrict.
About redistricting.
Like, come on.
I want to know where you see it, these mid-cycle redistrictings, its implications for 2026, but also beyond 2026. Like what's going to happen?
Well, we're going to start redistricting every 5 minutes is what's going to happen. I think this moment is unique for a couple reasons. Or one, we've seen mid-decade redistricting before. Texas Republicans also went for 5 seats in 2004. Democrats in New York redrew the map in advance of 2024 in a much less aggressive way. But what we're seeing now is parties replacing their own gerrymanders with even more aggressive gerrymanders. Whereas in the past, typically when there's been a mid-decade redraw, it's replaced a court-ordered map. And that's been a legislative justification for what's happened. So in that sense, I think it's new territory. The second is that all these states are considering it at once. And that arms race factor, it has reinforced the truth that the ability to go back and crack open a map is a a real advantage. In Ohio, where the constitutional amendment said that a map could only be valid for 4 years, well, that sounded like a penalty, but it's really not. It allows the ruling party to go in and fine-tune the districts depending on the circumstances that would maximally benefit them in a given year. The biggest constraint I see is, let's say you're a Republican in Indiana, and you're looking at, or you're under pressure to draw a 9-0 map in that state. But we're also looking at a lot of special election results where Democrats are outperforming the Harris-Trump margin by 12, 15 points. If you're a Republican in the Indianapolis suburbs, do you suddenly want to take on a lot of Andre Carson's district in Indianapolis in a year like 2026? So that's the constraint that I see at the moment that may complicate the parties, or at least Republicans, going as far as they want to in some of these cases. That said, there's a common misconception that it's technological advancements in software that have allowed for gerrymandering to become a lot more powerful. Go back and look at a map of Houston's congressional districts from the early 90s. They're indecipherable. We didn't have great technology back then, but our capabilities.
Rorschach test, basically.
Yeah, it's a Rorschach test.
Inkblot.
And yet, we have cleaner looking districts in a lot of places than we did now. Gerrymandering was just as doable then. It just took longer with sorting precincts on a wall. But what's really happened is that the country has self-sorted, and that has multiplied and magnified the power of gerrymandering because it makes it easier for partisan map makers to segregate voters and crack and pack them.
I guess I'll keep it brief because Dave's the expert here. I'm a real pessimist on this question. I think that, as Dave said, we've entered into a universe where there's no reason why you aren't going to gerrymander your maps every opportunity you get. I think we're seeing a bunch of states do it this cycle. Next cycle, it's going to continue, right? New York is going to redraw its maps ahead of 2028. We'll see what happens in Virginia if Spanberger gets elected. She said she won't do it, but we'll see what happens when she gets elected. In Colorado, I think there's talk about going back on their redistricting commission. If Florida doesn't do it this cycle, they're going to do it next cycle. And so I do think that we have kind of broken the seal here on redistricting for partisan advantage at every given moment. If the VRA gets junked, as many expect it to, that will unleash another round of redistricting across the South in particular ahead of 2028.
Will you say just a word about the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court, just like a year or two after deciding this case that arose out of a situation in Alabama and Louisiana, is going to redecide it. And what they could do is essentially remove whatever remaining requirements there are to have minority opportunity districts in anywhere, but particularly in the American South, where you have states like Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina, where you have significant black populations that vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and the Supreme Court until now has essentially said you have to give those voters at least one opportunity, or in the case of Alabama and Louisiana, 2 opportunities to elect representatives of their choosing, and otherwise you can do any gerrymandering you want. And the Supreme Court may essentially, this is reductive here, but they may come in and say, actually, open season, do whatever you want, back to, as Jeff was pointing out, an older system of redistricting that would wipe out a lot of those majority-minority or minority opportunity seats. So that's a real possibility. And I think what we're seeing is that there's very little political penalty to redistricting, right? We're going to see what happens in California, which is going to be one of the rare instances where voters actually get a say in what happens. I happen to think California voters will approve that measure when push comes to shove. But if you're a state legislator, there's very little downside to this. If you're a member of Congress, there's very little downside to this because you're not seeing a political penalty. It's much harder to pay a penalty because the districts are gerrymandered. So, you can only exact pressure statewide. In a lot of these states, the opposition party doesn't have the power to push back statewide. It's not like California is going to elect a Republican governor because they're so upset about redistricting. I think the Indiana case is so interesting to me because it does not make any sense, right? There's no reason why Indiana, of all of these Republican states, should be so hesitant to redraw their maps when every other Republican state is falling in line. I'm fascinated by it. We'll see if they end up holding out for longer. I wonder if some of this, though, is that it's really great to be a 9-0 House delegation, 2 Republican senators, Republican governor, all Republican statewide offices, when there's a Republican president and Republican Congress in D.C. But the minute Democrats get back into control, either in the White House or in Congress, it might be really lonely for a state that has no Democrats in elected office at all. Who are you going to call? Who do you still have a good working relationship with? That if something comes up that your state needs, which will happen, you no longer even have your one token member of the delegation who can work with the majority party to get a little bit more money, right? You are entirely frozen out all by your own hand. So there is a political consequence that I can foresee, but it's incredibly downstream, and I don't think anyone's really thinking about that very much right now.
Yeah, I think I would just add 2 things, which is one, I also agree that we are really headed for a race to the bottom on this. And I do wonder if in the end, many years from now, there is a reaction to all this where you get some sort of major effort to avoid a situation where we're redrawing lines constantly. Maybe that's a constitutional amendment of some kind. Maybe that's, we tend to see historically, you don't usually see constitutional amendments and then they kind of come in quick succession, and so I kind of wonder about sort of a long-term possibility of a reaction to this if it really turns into the race to the bottom that I'm suspicious it's going to turn into, with states constantly redistricting and people getting frustrated with this over time, that building so there's actually support, more and more support, and a bipartisan support to avoid this. Another factor that I think is there's an interesting kind of give and take here is with incumbents, and because incumbents and members of the U.S. House of Representatives, they like their districts to not change because they like to know the people in their district. They, if they have to advertise a bunch to be like, hey, I'm now going to be your representative, hopefully, that costs money and time and energy, and it also opens up the risk of a primary challenge, perhaps if they take on too many new constituents, and maybe there's an opportunity for someone to challenge them. And what's interesting here, though, is it's kind of when I think about like the historical examples of mid-decade redistricting, a lot of that happened at a time when incumbency was not much of a thing. In terms of members, people did not hang around Congress for that long most of the time in like the late 19th century. They might 2-3 terms. Now, though, in the aftermath of much of the 20th century, where over time you develop this thing where people might be in Congress for 20, 30 years, and there was a lot of institutional know-how and value to that, and careerist members became a thing. Now, though, we have this interplay with the partisanship and the feeling that every little seat could matter because things are so closely contested, and that's a huge factor in why we're reaching this point. How does that interplay with incumbents who might want to hang around for 10, 12, 20 years, and their districts are going to change more often, and they're not going to like that because they tend to like their districts to not change much. So I'm kind of curious about how much, like right now, a lot of incumbent Republicans in the House are, in like Indiana, for instance, are pushing for a remap. They are supporting it. And I just am curious if that's going to eventually run up against, because we're seeing this some in like Republicans in California being like Kevin Kiley being like, hey, we just need to ban mid-decade redistricting. I mean, obviously this is a little bit, self-interest here. He doesn't want to lose his seat, but it's for members of a political party who happen to come from a state where they're in the minority usually, do they end up being like a voice in the wilderness crying out to stop this or to put a lid on it a little bit, and incumbents eventually getting tired of the remaps constantly happening and getting frustrated by the maps changing all the time. And I just am curious because this is a kind of a new thing, having the careerism in the House plus the partisanship is a little different than where we were the last time that there was a lot of mid-decade redistricting.
Very interesting. If you have a question, please identify yourself and please try to keep it succinct. So who has a question for our panelists?
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Parker. I'm a PhD student at UNC. We've heard a lot about comparisons to previous elections over history, which I think is super useful. I'm curious if instead of comparing over time, you think there are places we should be looking to compare across space. What other countries should we be looking at right now to maybe predict a little bit better what's going to be happening in our elections soon? Thanks.
Well, I mean, okay, here. Okay, so there is definitely, if you think about sort of the broader political picture in Western democracies right now, clearly there is a major populist wave, particularly on the right, that's going on. I think we have to be careful about comparing. Comparative politics is super useful. However, there are times when, like, the specific electoral circumstances may not be particularly helpful because, Germany is using proportional representation or something, and that's not really comparable. But I do think the fact that you see, like, the Reform Party or whatever in the UK making strides because people are so upset with the two major parties at this point, are just frustrated with the status quo, and those most of these countries where a lot of this is, or in Western Europe, are multi-party systems, and we don't have that here. And it's going to be very difficult to bring about a multi-party system in the United States without some pretty substantial institutional changes. So I guess for me, it's sort of seeing like the sort of continued frustration with the status quo, frustration with systems. I mean, you look at polling in like the United States, and people have like the trust in like institutions has plummeted. And so I think if you're sort of thinking about like the commonalities, it's not necessarily so much the elections, but it's thinking about like the themes. So obviously immigration is a big common theme that we're hearing across Western democracies, developed countries. Complaints about how government is working, where it's not working. Just a general sense that institutions aren't doing enough, and are like incapable of doing things. In fact, I would say is a real strong tone that you get across them. So I think that's like that. The themes are probably where it is most helpful to think about them.
What stands out to me comparatively is in global inflationary and supply chain disruption post-COVID environment, we've seen some massive swings in other democracies. I think that there was a 19-point swing against the Tories in the last UK election, and yet the swing between 2020 and 2024 in the presidential races was effectively 6. So I think that speaks to just how polarized we are in our party system, but also Democrats actually ran a fairly formidable campaign to try and overcome the horrible disadvantage of having presided over inflation over the Biden years, and the swing was even half of that in the swing states, which I think speaks to probably an organizational and ground superiority of the Democrats, even though Kamala Harris was a weak candidate.
Yeah, I guess to indulge in like a tiny bit of exceptionalism, I do think that like we're in a lot of ways electorally we're just in a different place. In terms of scale, right? A country of 330 plus million people, in terms of the age of our political system, which is essentially older than any other country that is doing elections right now. And in terms of just like the unique political dynamics, I agree with both of these guys. I don't necessarily look at other countries to inform specifically electorally. I think that we can learn a lot about what is on people's minds globally in terms of the issue space to an extent. I think we can learn a lot about what our politicians are thinking about, right? I think a lot about Poland these days. I think a lot about Hungary. Those are two places where Trump has expressed a lot of support for the leaders in those states and the actions that they've taken. I mean, I don't think that it's a particularly radical thing to say that Trump really admires Viktor Orban. He is probably the only Western leader who admires Viktor Orban. And, I think there are lessons we can learn from that kind of thing. But when it comes to who's going to win New York's, 4th congressional district next year, I'm not necessarily looking much further afield than Long Island.
Let's take a last question.
Hi, Miriam Ashkenazi from Circle at Tisch at Tufts. So I'm going to ask about young people. So currently there's only one House seat occupied by someone from Generation Z. And obviously no Senate seats because they're not old enough yet. But I'm just curious of what you think of this up-and-coming generation and how it's going to impact what's happening now, right? I think we don't pay enough attention to youth voices in politics. And we're really starting to see that. If you look at New York and Mondani, we're really starting to see that impact. So I'm just wondering where you all are on that.
Yeah, look, I think what's different about this youngest generation of voters is that they're perhaps less ideological than what we've framed the electorate as in the past, and they're more driven by who they perceive to be authentic or speaking to them directly without filters. I think if Democrats have learned anything from the last couple of years, it's that they can't expect to run the same 7-state teleprompter rally campaign and expect to succeed with the same types of margins that Obama generated in 08 and 12. And so when I think of the Democrats, obviously Republicans, Trump advance, were able to break through and win higher percentages, particularly with young men. But where were Democrats able to really overperform if you go district by district? It runs the ideological gamut. AOC and MGP, Marique Luzon-Camperez, they both outperformed the Harris-Trump margin by 8 points.
The initials.
The initials in their district.
Gotta have the 3 initials.
Yeah, they're really effective at utilizing social media to resonate with their audience, which is why, my deep prediction that I'll leave you guys with. Even though the polling leaders for 2028 right now might be, Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris.
Peaking early.
Yeah. I think the 2028 Democratic nomination is going to come down to AOC and Alyssa Slotkin.
Wow.
Ideologically, two very different Democrats. But I'll tell you what. When Slotkin first came to our office in 2018 and we interviewed her, she cursed up a storm. And actually, I thought that was a pretty good sign of her chances to win a swing seat in Michigan.
That's the secret sauce, cursing.
Yeah. Hey, I think Abigail Spanberger dropped an F-bomb on a podcast the other day. So, which I was like, oh, all right. Okay, so thinking about young voters, and I've been thinking about this actually a lot in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, because, and I wrote a little something about it. It was essentially, we saw among sort of Gen Z voters, and we're seeing in their voter registration numbers, that they are, at least for the moment, notably less democratic than people who were just a little older than them, younger millennials. And I think what is interesting to see is sort of, does that continue? And I think this is where thinking about the long run of American politics is helpful, is that we definitely see historically sort of a generational cohort effect where where you came in, what was going on in politics at the time that you came of age and became politically aware and entered the electorate, that tends to weigh heavily, historically at least, on where your partisan proclivities may lie. And usually it's because the party in power became really unpopular, and so you ended up on the other side. So, like a lot of people in my age range are very democratic because they grew up with like the Iraq War, George W. Bush, the economic crisis, and the early years of Barack Obama. And so they moved into the Democratic camp very heavily. Well, Joe Biden was a pretty unpopular president. Young people, I think in particular, had zero connection with him. And frustration with the status quo and the inflation and just cost of living and opportunity, can't buy a house. Like people who are just, in sort of that 18 to 29 age range are understandably frustrated. And so, what's the alternative? Well, the Republicans. And was the economy seemingly pretty good under Donald Trump until COVID hit? Yes, at least that's what people say that. That's how people remember Trump's presidency, is the economy was really good. Are they going to remember that after his second term? Remains to be seen, given how things are going. No, I'm just saying, obviously, there's still inflation concerns, and people are economic confidence indicators are not very good right now. But at least when you're thinking about the 2024 election and why a bunch of less engaged young voters seem to have shifted at least into a situation where it was closer to 50-50 instead, or at least it was a lot closer than it had been among that age group in recent years, I think speaks to that dissatisfaction. And potentially, if you keep voting for the same party, you tend to end up with that party in the long run for most of the time. And so that to me is the thing to really watch. And it wouldn't shock me. And I think it's really interesting in the context of thinking about the sort of demographics as destiny conversation that we were having back in 2008 to 12, right? And how wrong that turned out to be. And I think this is a perfect example of that, because you're talking about the most racially and ethnically diverse group of Americans ever. And yet they were not more Democratic leaning at all. And so that to me is really fascinating. There's also a big gender gap conversation that there could be a massive gender gap if this holds up. If young men remain much more Republican than young women. So that could have all kinds of societal things. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, the interesting thing in my mind about young voters, as Jeff said, is just the variability, the swing, right? On two fronts, right? We see, if we look at Trump's approval rating versus his vote support, I think the two largest swings are probably among Hispanic and Latino voters and young voters, people who swung the hardest toward Trump relative to 2020 and have swung the hardest against him since 2024. And that speaks to, the lack of consistency. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but just that young voters are the least ideologically kind of moored of any cohort. The other thing, of course, is that being young is not immutable. I think we're all discovering this. Is that unlike if you're a black voter your whole life, right? If you are a college-educated voter, you don't lose that degree. You can be Elise Stefanik and send your degree back, but she's still a college-educated. She still went to Harvard. We forgive her for that. But but being a young voter, essentially, eventually, you God willing, you stop being a young voter. And so to Jeff's point, I think we're not just tracking is there something about youth? Is there something about the particular people who are young at this particular time? The other thing I'll say, to your point about the lack of Gen Z representation in Congress beyond Max Frost, and I hope he's the only one because he's the only member of Congress who's younger than me, and we're going to keep it that way. But I do think that the barriers to entry to running for office have become so high for congressional races that I honestly think we're not going to see. I don't think that he's necessarily the start of this big wave. I think Jeff can probably explain this better than I can, but if you go back in time, young people used to get elected to Congress all the time. There were 24-year-olds in Congress, which is not constitutional, but they didn't care because people just got elected and they showed up. And nowadays, you've got to raise $300,000 in your first 24 hours if you want to have anyone take your campaign seriously. You've got to raise $5 million if you want to win even a moderately competitive race, maybe even just a moderately competitive primary. That's a really heavy lift for someone who is just starting out their career, especially if they're running against a 30-year incumbent. And so I guess I can think of a few. There's a candidate in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District who is very young, already a former state representative because he got his start so early. I broke news about a wildland firefighter out in Montana who I think still, no, because he's like a year or two older than me, so he's a millennial. So he doesn't even count, but he graduated college in probably 2016. Beyond that, you're hard pressed to find candidates who can put together the kind of campaign that's necessary to win in the modern age, who don't have that kind of support. That's what makes Mamdani such an anomaly in a lot of ways, and I think it speaks to his singular political talent that he was able to make that happen. But also, again, he's not Gen Z, right? Like, he's in his early 30s. He had his career in the state assembly. He came up through a very established political system. Coming out of DSA, I think, was incredibly important for him because it gave him the kind of structure and resources that a lot of young candidates, if they're not attached to any particular operation, don't have and will be a major impediment to their success.
Please join me in thanking our outstanding panelists.
Thank you. Can I say one last thing? Jacob, you may be the youngest of us, but your beard has already surpassed the rest of us.
Great job, guys.